Hello everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists episode 11. I am Mark Moncrief from Upon Hope and I have with me Mark Richardson from Oz Conservative. How are you, Mark?
I'm well, good to see you again, Mark.
Yes. Now, you were talking before off air about the New York Times.
Yeah, there's a little interesting update to the New York Times. The New York Times, if you're not aware, is one of the leading papers of liberalism internationally. It's a paper of record in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think it was about a year or so ago, maybe a couple of years even, that there was a controversy because they appointed to their board a young Asian American woman called Sarah Zhong, if that's how you pronounce her name. And it was controversial because in her Twitter feed, Sarah Zhong had made a whole lot of very stridently anti-white tweets, very full-on in attacking white people. And so there were complaints, but she was nonetheless accepted with open arms onto the board of the New York Times. However, the update is that she has now been dismissed. And the reason is not because of her animus toward white people. It's because she advised a left-wing friend that it would be a great idea...
This was publicly?
Publicly. On social media, she had advised her left-wing friend that it would be a great and effective tactic to push the New York Times in the right direction, which for her means in a more woke direction, if they all cancel their subscriptions. And seemingly that's the line you cannot cross. You can say you can be as woke as you like politically, but just don't encourage people to...
Bring in the money.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the money thing, you can't touch that.
Yeah.
So she's been dismissed.
Oh, well, that's sad, isn't it? That's very, very sad.
Oh, it's tragic, yes.
Couldn't happen to a nicer person.
No, that's right. She probably, I suspect that she'll end up somewhere else, but there you go, she had a little setback.
And we had a little win.
Yes.
That's great. Now, today we're going to talk about the origins of liberalism. And in our last podcast, you actually talked about having done research on this topic. So I'm expecting great things here.
Oh.
I'm expecting you to answer all the questions.
Yeah, it's a big topic, isn't it? This one is one of the... If you had a traditionalist university, you could set up a department to look into this issue.
Yes. And
there are lots of different answers that people come up with, all of which have some merit, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But I have read a lot about this and thought a lot. But I suspect that the best starting point is there are some people who think that the problems sort of began in the 1990s or the 1980s or something like that. And when you look into it, you realise that actually you have to go back a lot further in time.
Well, that's when we actually became aware of the issue ourselves.
Yeah.
And it was obvious that it went back a lot longer than that. And then, of course, people then say, oh, well, it started in the 60s.
Well, that's right. So the radicalism of the 60s often gets blamed.
Yes. And then you get on the right, you get, it's the end of World War II.
Yep.
Or the end of World War One.
Well, World War One, that's considered a big one. But I'm afraid when you look into it, you have to keep pushing back. But before we go back even further, I do want to... If you look at the way Australian politics is now, that was really firmly in place by at least the 1870s.
Yeah.
So David Syme was a Scottish immigrant to Australia in the 1850s. He set up the Age newspaper, which Melbourne listeners will readily know is still around.
Mm-hmm.
And he was what I would call a left liberal. He was an early example of a left liberal in Australia.
Yep.
And the Age newspaper from the beginning pushed left liberalism. And that was the idea that it wasn't enough to have the more classical liberal idea that you just pursued your own self-interest in the market. He thought that you should also have the larger interest as represented by the state, and that it was, so it's a more progressivism should be pushed via the means of the state rather than just the free market.
Yep.
And so from that point onwards, you get a kind of left liberal grouping, and you have the classical liberals, and each of them is claiming the mantle of being the true liberals.
Yes.
So the left liberals are saying, hey, we're the progressives, but the classical liberals are saying, no, we're the true liberals. And that's from the 1870s onwards. So we've kind of been stuck in that pattern since way back then. And of course, that's not even, if you want to look into the beginnings of liberalism, you have to go back much further than that. So the word itself started to be used in a political sense they've actually traced it back to 1769 was the first use of the word in a political sense.
Oh, all right.
And that was with the more classical liberals who did the Adam Smith types, who thought that people involved in commerce should be able to just do what they wanted to do without interference.
Well, laissez-faire
Laissez-faire,
is the classical liberal interpretation of the economy, that the businesses should be able to do as they wanted.
Yeah, that's right. And so they started to talk about liberal policy in economics and so on. And then in the 1820s, it began to be used to describe the ideology that we would more think of as left-wing liberalism. It started in Spain but spread quickly elsewhere.
Yep.
And you had the man I'm reading about at the moment, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was a famous radical poet. He and some other poets set up a magazine called The Liberal, which pushed what for the time were quite radical liberal ideas regarding the family, regarding monarchy, a whole series of things really. And Shelley himself, he would have fitted into quite a radical, woke, left-wing milieu of today. So, we're talking about the 1820s. And the 1820s, though, you have to even go back. I know this will sound strange to some people, but even that is not really the start of liberalism itself. The word starts. The word starts then, the actual phrase liberalism, as a political term. But I have written posts lately on really interesting debates that go back to the 1620s.
Yep.
And where you'll have a more traditionalist, you'll have a pamphlet on a certain issue. The one I looked at was about, it was actually about sex roles in society.
And transvestite.
And that's it. And it was a really interesting discussion because one side, the one in favour of gender bending, if you like, was put in very familiar liberal terms that people would understand today, which was that we should be able to do whatever we have a mind to do, and I should be an autonomous individual, and it's just a convention to think otherwise, which we should be breaking down. And then you have the more traditionalist voice giving the counter argument to that. But that's a debate taking place in the 1620s. And, of course, in the later 1600s, you had Hobbes and Locke and so on, who were sort of commonly regarded as having set the template for liberal forms of government and the kinds of...
the interesting thing about those two is that in their day, they weren't actually regarded that highly.
Yeah.
And in fact, they were in danger of being forgotten. And because liberalism took the forefront, then liberalism went looking for people who... a pedigree.
Yeah.
And they brought these guys back out. That's much more true of Locke than Hobbes, but basically they were dragged into the limelight after they were dead.
Well, that's right, and you find that with quite a few of these characters. It's the same with Shelley, that he wasn't highly regarded as a political thinker in his own time, but as the logic of the whole liberal project keeps moving forward, that he is then discovered and held to be a great liberal figure for his time.
Yeah.
So he didn't begin to be popularised until later in the 1800s. Really.
Now, I know on your site, Oz Conservative, that you have actually put the first liberal writings that you found from the 1400s. That's right. So there was, in the Renaissance, there were some writers who, you probably call them proto-liberals, I suppose. I think that's the best way to put them.
That it was a kind of an instinct which later developed into, and the one I remember was Pico della Mirandola, who was an Italian, and if I remember the quote, it was basically, his idea was that man was special because we didn't have a fixed nature, that we could decide for ourselves what we would be.
Yep.
I very much doubt he had in mind that this idea would lead on to the kind of woke politics that you see today, where people choose their own sex and that kind of thing. But the idea is there, isn't it? You're right, that goes back to, I think, the late 1400s, if I remember.
Yeah. And it's quite remarkable that you can read things like that so early.
Yeah.
And it really puts lie to the notion that everything went wrong in the 1990s.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I read history, the lesson I learn is
there's the lesson, everybody. Read
history. Wow, yeah. That there's almost like two currents of Western thought. One is the liberal one, which seems to always be there, which is that I should do whatever I have a will to do, and that's freedom, and that's what society should be organised around. You do find that, but to be fair, you do also find another tradition in the West as well, which says that no, we should be cultivating virtue, and we should be cultivating the more elevated aspects of our own nature and trying to suppress the baser aspects of our nature, and that we should respect the authority that is the accumulated wisdom of the past. And I think the difference with the 20th century is that second, the more traditional voice starts to be lost, and that's why we see things careering so out of control now that so it's not that there's something that the liberalism suddenly springs into being in the last 30 years and things have gone wrong. It's been there for a long time. It's had to be argued against and confronted, but we just lost that capacity to confront it and to keep it within certain bounds. It's become something that's now the whole of politics, really.
Yeah. You left a comment at my site about the churches and about how they really lost the fight in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at it, it's true. And since then, it's just been a constant retreat. But the big battle was actually fought and lost all the way back then.
Yeah, I agree strongly with that. So one of the real breaks on liberalism what was actually Christianity. That if you look at in the early 1800s, when you read the history of that time, the thing that strikes you is how seriously Christianity was taken at the time.
Yeah.
The poet I was talking about before, Percy Bysshe Shelley, he wanted to recruit a whole lot of young girls as acolytes to support his attempts to radicalise society. And in the book I'm reading, he chose his first two targets and sat them down and tried to convince them to his worldview, but it came unstuck because when he started to talk about atheism, the two girls said to him, "What's that? I don't understand. You'll need to explain this concept." That there was such a Christian society that the thought had never even occurred to them that this could exist.
Yeah.
And in a society, and for that reason, Shelley hated Christianity with a passion. So you'd think
Which is a theme we see over and over and over again.
Yeah, but the reason is it wasn't illogical from his point of view. You'd think he might have attacked sort of more conservative personalities like Edmund Burke or something like that, but he never mentions them even. It's this passionate hatred of Christianity, and he hated Christianity because it stood in his way of a radical liberal society that he was after. It was Christianity that was applying the brakes rather than any real political establishment.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Catholic Church in the 1800s actually did quite openly and explicitly try and confront liberalism, and some of the popes put out encyclicals against liberalism. But, yeah, by the mid-20th century, there was not much resistance anymore from the churches. That fell away, and that was one of the last breaks, if you like.
Yeah. I think that the start of liberalism is also a religious question, because it seems to me that all of the political ideologies are all Christian heresies.
Yeah.
And they're all specifically Protestant heresies. And that's where we start to see the beginnings of liberalism and secularism is in the Reformation, because there's no Christian unity. And in fact, that Christian unity is specifically and relentlessly attacked. And it now means that you need a replacement. And one of the Protestant ideas is that you can have a personal relationship with God. But what happens when God doesn't talk back?
Yeah.
Well, then you start to think, well, hey, maybe there is no God. Maybe it's all up to me. Well, if it's all up to me, well, maybe I'm God. And this is a recurring theme. And I think here in our age, many people think that the great religious question of our age is, does God exist? But the great religious question is man God?
Yes.
And you actually hear people talking like this. If you pay attention, you will hear people asking this question. Not framed exactly like that, but very close.
No, I agree. And you find that more when Christianity, when Orthodox Christianity really loses its hold on the intellectual class after the 1850s.
Yeah.
That actually comes up quite openly, that you have people who try and find this halfway point where humans are somehow helping God with God's plan for the universe.
And that's part of the cult of progress.
Yeah, that's
so this
exactly.
is all part of God's plan. We're God's agents.
Correct. So it was this attempt to somehow almost divinize or make divine both progress as the grand plan,
mm-hmm.
but humans as sort of semi-divine lieutenants in all of this.
Yeah.
And I mean, H.G. Wells was someone who toyed with this idea, the novelist,
yes,
the famous, very influential novelist at the time. But there were quite a lot. It's kind of this humanist instinct, and I know humanism sounds nice as a word. It sounds like you support humanity, but more specifically, it really was trying somehow to have humanity take over the role that God had once played in traditional Western thought.
Absolutely, yeah. And the more I think about secularism, the more, because I mean, I think like most people, I was brought up and I just assumed the term was, it's just neutral.
Yeah.
It just means religion has its place, but it's not in the public square. But increasingly, it's become obvious that it's much more than that. It's about getting rid of religion. And what's also obvious to me, maybe to many other people, is that most people need religion. They need that. They are spiritual. They need that spiritual input into their life, and they also need that guidance. And that's being taken away from them on purpose.
Yes. Well, again, I agree on all those points, and in fact, you'd almost have a little podcast on each one. But it is painfully obvious, isn't it, that most people find it difficult to self-regulate successfully, even in their own self-interest, in terms of how they choose to act in relationships or in a whole in different aspects of their life. And as I get older, I more and more start to realise the wisdom of having something like, I grew up a Catholic, and in the Catholic Church there's something called the magisterium, which is the inherited body of teaching, or the accumulated body of teaching of the Church, the authoritative teaching. And to change the magisterium, you can do it, but it has to be done in a specific way. It requires, I forget the rules, but something like the agreement of the Pope and the bishops, or the bishops and the council of the Church. Yeah. So it can't be done willy-nilly. It has to be done in a very serious way. And the advantage of having that is that it then it's not up to the whim or the caprice of an individual to decide, which individuals tend to be very bad at doing. Mm-hmm. I think you need something equivalent to that to have a really well-functioning society. You look at the choices that people make, or even that maybe you make yourself when you're young, and you realise that you do need that guidance, as you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things that I've increasingly noticed is people often, we're told that people should look after their own self-interests.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how often people are not capable of doing that.
Absolutely.
And are not even capable of recognising what is in their interests. And, because people often think very short term.
Yes.
And they don't think about how it's going to affect other people. That's the great thing. That's one of the great advantages of liberalism, is it's a selfish philosophy.
Yeah.
And, it's all about what I want right now. Give me that.
Yeah.
And in exchange, I hand over power to them, and they get to make all the big decisions.
Yeah. And they rationalise their decisions. I tried arguing on social media with some leftists, which is never a very good idea, the other day, and I just was left banging my head against the wall once again and regretting the decision, because you can't really even engage logically. So the topic was tattoos.
Ah, yes.
And I was just trying to put the very simple proposition that a lot of men don't like to see a woman covered in tattoos. They don't find it attractive. So it's a very simple thing. And I was trying to argue with some leftist women, and I got nowhere, and I was never going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
They demanded scientific evidence, so I gave them research from leading universities on male attitudes. They said, you've only given us 3 research things. So I gave them 10. And they said, but one of them is 10 years old. The research is 10 years old, so we're not accepting any of this. And on it went. And it just shows you that people, a lot of people are just, either going to go with the herd in their thinking, or will rationalise away and just do whatever they impulsively want to do.
Yep.
And I'm not saying people shouldn't be encouraged to try and regulate their own lives as well as they can, but people need assistance. They need help from culture, and I think the church did once help people.
Yeah.
Or the churches, in a way that is decreasingly the case.
Yes. I actually heard a great argument against tattoos, and it was, if someone gave you a piece of clothing
Mm.
that you could never take off,
Yeah.
would you put it on? And most people would not put it on.
No.
But that's what a tattoo is.
Yeah.
It's something you can never take off.
Well, look, I agree. I've never seen the attraction
Yeah.
in tattoos at all. I have to accept that a lot of people do, but it worries
So
me.
the rumour that you have a giant eagle on your chest is... Are you willing to deny it here?
Oh, you don't want to check, do you? My God. No. Well, one of the things that worries me is sometimes we, as a sex, we think that what we find attractive in the opposite sex, that they themselves find attractive, vice versa.
Yeah.
So men think that women who are nice are attractive. So some men assume that, well, women in return will think men being nice is attractive and are disappointed when that's not true.
Yes.
And I think some women possibly do find men with tattoos at least physically attractive. And in fact, the research, when I looked up when I was debating these women, the research said that women found men with tattoos on average to be more physically attractive but less attractive as marital partners because less trustworthy.
Yep.
So it's that bad boy thing. It's exactly what you'd expect.
Yeah.
And it worries me that some women think that men have the same instinct or impulse, and that we will think that women who have tattoos are kind of cool, edgy, bad girl types, which it kind of maybe is true, but for most men, women who give you that, who you have that response to, are not wife material, are they?
Yeah.
They're not the kind of women. It sends a message.
It does send a message, yeah.
Possibly not the one that women think that they're sending.
Exactly,
That's what I'm saying.
exactly. And on that point, I think we'll end it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark Richardson. Where can people find more of your thinking?
They can find heaps of my thinking if they so desire at ozconservative.blogspot.com.au. That's Oz with OZ.
And I'm Mark Moncrief, and you can find more of my thinking at Upon Hope. Just type that into your favourite search engine and you'll find the site. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And everyone, have a good day.